January 7th, 1945. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his SATF headquarters, reading the press conference transcript in his hand. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had held a press conference that morning in Belgium. He had talked about the Ardennes battle. He had described the Battle of the Bulge, and what he said was driving Eisenhower crazy with anger. Montgomery had said at the press conference that the Ardennes battle was one of the most interesting and difficult battles he had managed. He had claimed American units were in disarray. He had stated that he had stepped in and taken control. He had implied that British leadership had saved American units. Eisenhower threw the transcript on the desk. He stood up. He began pacing in the office. Chief of Staff General Walter Bedell Smith was watching with concern. He had been working with Eisenhower for 3 years. He had never seen him this angry. Numbers were spinning in Eisenhower's mind. 19,000 Americans had died in the Ardennes. Thousands more were wounded. Patton had turned his army 90 degrees in a snowstorm. Bradley had fought day and night. First Army units had defended every meter of ground with blood. And now was Montgomery appropriating all this for himself? Smith was given instructions for an urgent meeting. Bradley, Patton, Hodges, all were summoned to headquarters. Eisenhower, meanwhile, picked up the transcript again. He read it carefully. Each word brought a new wave of anger. In the transcript, Montgomery had written that American commanders were in panic, that there was no organization. He had claimed that he came and immediately took control of the situation. He had stated that he reorganized offensive lines, made counterattack plans. He had said success was a result of his own leadership. For Eisenhower, this wasn't just a lie. This was betrayal. Before continuing the story, please hit the like button. It helps us reach more people with these forgotten stories. If you're new to our channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. While Eisenhower waited for the meeting, he thought about the real events in the Ardennes. The German attack that began on December 16, 1944, was truly shocking. 3 Panzer armies had emerged from the snow-covered Ardennes forests and charged at American lines. The first days were chaotic. 8 corps had scattered. Communication lines had been cut. Thousands of American soldiers were besieged. But there was no panic as claimed. American units were showing disciplined resistance. The 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne was fighting heroically under siege. Eisenhower had assessed the situation on the evening of December 16th. He had called an emergency meeting in Verdun. Plans had been made calmly. The critical decision was made at that meeting. 1st Army and 9th Army would be temporarily placed under Montgomery's command. The reason was entirely geographical. Bradley's headquarters was in the south. These armies were in the north. Bradley couldn't physically communicate. Montgomery was in the north, geographically closer. It was a temporary arrangement. When the crisis ended, the armies would return to Bradley. This decision was difficult for Eisenhower. It was humiliating for Bradley. It was unacceptable for Patton. But the military logic was clear. Unity of command was needed. War wasn't one with emotional decisions. Montgomery had arrived at the Northern Front on December 20th, and what Eisenhower feared had happened. Montgomery had acted like a savior. He had looked down on American generals. He had criticized existing plans. He had begun reorganizing everything. He had pulled back defensive lines. He had canceled counterattacks. But the real rescue was happening in the South. Patton had turned 3rd Army 90 degrees. He was marching it north in a snowstorm, on icy roads, in impossible conditions. He had gone on the offensive on December 22nd. He was advancing every day under enemy fire. He had reached Bastogne on December 26th. He had broken the siege. He had opened supply routes. Montgomery, meanwhile, was reorganizing in the north. He was preparing. He was drawing plans. But there was no attack. Until January 3rd. For 2 full weeks, he hadn't launched a counterattack. Eisenhower knew these facts very well. The numbers were clear. Of the 19,000 soldiers who died in the Ardennes, 95% were American. 80% of the fighting units were American. Patton had made the first counterattack. Americans had saved Bastogne. And now Montgomery was coming and taking all the credit. He was telling the world press that the Americans were in disarray, that he had organized them. This wasn't distorting history. This was stealing history. Bradley, Patton, and Hodges arrived at headquarters in the afternoon. All three had heard Montgomery's press conference. All three carried deep anger. Bradley was especially wounded. First Army and Ninth Army were his armies. He had been commanding them since Normandy. Their temporary assignment to Montgomery was already humiliating. Now Montgomery was acting as if these armies had always been his. Patton's reaction was harsher. Third Army had moved 133,000 soldiers in a snowstorm. He had reached Bastogne in 6 days. He had accomplished a historic maneuver, and Montgomery was ignoring this, as if nothing had happened in the South. Hodges was quiet but deeply wounded. First Army was under his command. It had experienced the heaviest fighting in the Ardennes. His men had resisted German panzers for days. They had fought for every square. When Montgomery arrived, he had rejected defensive plans. He had acted as if American commanders didn't know how to fight. Eisenhower summarized the situation. Montgomery's claims were unacceptable. They were lies, and they needed to be corrected. Bradley spoke clearly. If Montgomery's words weren't corrected, he would resign. This wasn't a simple threat. Bradley was a patient, measured general. There was a situation serious enough to drive him to a resignation threat. Patton went further. He demanded Montgomery's removal from command. But Eisenhower knew this was impossible. Churchill would protect him. There would be an alliance crisis. The war wasn't over yet. The road to Berlin was still long. At the end of the meeting, Eisenhower made a promise. He would correct the situation. He would make a statement. He would tell the truth. No one would resign. The alliance would be preserved. But Montgomery's insolence wouldn't go unpunished. January 8, 1945. When Winston Churchill heard the news in London, he immediately saw the political consequences. Montgomery's press conference had been received with enthusiasm in Britain. The British press had run big headlines. But Churchill anticipated the reaction in America. Churchill knew 3 things very well. First, Britain was now the junior partner. The war couldn't be won without American power. Second, American public opinion was sensitive. They had been suffering heavy casualties since Pearl Harbor. They wouldn't accept their sacrifices being belittled. Third, Montgomery's ego was endangering the alliance. Churchill immediately sent a private telegram to Eisenhower. He stated that Montgomery's words were unfortunate. He acknowledged they harmed the alliance. He indicated he wanted to correct the situation. Eisenhower's answer was clear. Montgomery's words were unacceptable. American public opinion was angry. Generals were in revolt. Correction was essential. Otherwise, the alliance could crack. Churchill understood the message. On January 9th, he made an important speech in the House of Commons. With carefully chosen words, he corrected Montgomery. He emphasized that American units had fought heroically in the Ardennes. He stated that most of the casualties were American. He said most of the battle was won by Americans. He declared that Montgomery had made valuable contributions, but victory was won with American blood. This speech was critical. The British Prime Minister was openly correcting Montgomery. He was acknowledging the Americans' rights. It was a politically humble stance, but it was necessary because Britain needed America. Montgomery's ego couldn't change that fact, but Churchill's speech couldn't completely repair the damage Montgomery had caused. A crack had formed. Trust had been shaken. American generals now looked at Montgomery differently. January 10, 1945. Eisenhower could no longer remain silent. He needed to make an official statement, but he had to be careful. He couldn't directly accuse Montgomery. Alliance politics wouldn't allow it, but he also couldn't distort the facts. American generals wouldn't accept that. Eisenhower prepared a press release. He reviewed the text many times. He weighed every word. The result was diplomatic but clear. In the Ardennes battle, Allied units displayed exemplary cooperation. American First Army and Ninth Army were temporarily placed under Field Marshal Montgomery's command. This was entirely for geographical reasons. Montgomery made valuable contributions. but the architect of victory are American soldiers. The bulletin continued. General Patton's Third Army accomplished a historic maneuver. It reached Bastogne in 6 days. General Bradley's leadership was flawless. General Hodges's First Army resisted heroically. Most of the casualties are American. Victory was won with American blood. This statement was important. For the first time, Eisenhower was openly correcting Montgomery's version. He was laying out the facts. He was emphasizing the American contribution. But Eisenhower also wrote a private letter to Montgomery, not official, personal, but clear and harsh. He wrote that the press conference had created unacceptable consequences. He stated that American generals were deeply disappointed. He revealed that Bradley had threatened to resign, that Patton was furious. In the letter, he wrote that Montgomery's intention might have been good, but his words were misinterpreted. He reminded him that American units formed the majority in the Ardennes, that 95% of casualties were American, that Patton had made a critical contribution. He emphasized that these facts weren't visible in the press conference. The last paragraph was a threat. He wrote that if he wanted to preserve the alliance, he needed to make corrections. He stated that he needed to appreciate the American contribution. Otherwise, he implied the alliance could fall apart. When Montgomery received Eisenhower's letter, he was surprised. He had underestimated Eisenhower's anger. He hadn't thought the press conference would cause such an uproar, but now he understood this was a serious crisis. Montgomery wrote a reply on January 11th, but his reply was defensive and contained explanations rather than apologies. He claimed the press conference was misunderstood. He said he had no intention of belittling American units. He stated he was just explaining his own role. But Montgomery's letter didn't solve the problem, because instead of an apology, he was offering excuses. There was no real remorse, just a claim of misunderstanding. Eisenhower didn't find this sufficient. More importantly, Montgomery's behavior wasn't changing. In private conversations, he was still telling the same story. He was saying that American commanders were in panic in the Ardennes, that he had saved them. He was telling British officers how American units were disorganized, how he had organized them. These words leaked out. American officers heard. Reports reached Eisenhower. Montgomery was apologizing with his mouth, but continuing the same story with his behavior. Eisenhower's patience had completely run out. On January 15th, he wrote a second letter. This time it was harsher. He wrote that Montgomery's behavior needed to change. He stated that negative comments about American units needed to stop. Otherwise, he implied the command structure could change. This was a final threat. Montgomery understood. Now, he was really in danger. If he lost Eisenhower's support, even Churchill couldn't save him. January 17th, 1945. Montgomery finally grasped the seriousness of the situation. His chief of staff, Freddie de Guingamp, had met with Eisenhower and learned the truth. Eisenhower had prepared a dismissal order. It was waiting to be signed. One more wrong word and Montgomery's career would end. De Guingamp explained the situation to Montgomery. This time it was no joke. Eisenhower was truly hurt. American generals were in revolt. Bradley was demanding the return of First Army and Ninth Army. Patton was refusing to work with Montgomery. Montgomery finally wrote a real apology letter. He sent it to Eisenhower on January 18th. This time it was different. There were no excuses, just apology. The press conference had been a wrong decision. He acknowledged that he had no intention of belittling American units, but his words were understood that way. He stated that he was Eisenhower's loyal subordinate, that he would obey his orders. Eisenhower read the letter. He took out the dismissal order from the secret folder. He looked at it for a while. Then he put it back. They had overcome the crisis. But a deep wound had been opened in the alliance. Eisenhower sent a cold reply to Montgomery. He stated that he accepted the apology, but this wasn't enough. He wrote that his behavior needed to change. He reminded him that he needed to be respectful when working with American units. But the really important decision came later. On February 4th, Eisenhower returned First Army to Bradley. The temporary arrangement ended. Montgomery could only keep Ninth Army, and that too was temporary. This decision was symbolic. Eisenhower no longer trusted Montgomery. He didn't want to hand American armies over to him. The alliance continued, but trust had been shaken. May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. When Eisenhower began writing his memoirs, the Ardennes crisis became an important chapter. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote carefully but clearly. He stated that Montgomery's press conference had endangered the alliance. He described the justified anger of American generals. He wrote with appreciation of Churchill's intervention. But he didn't hide that trust in Montgomery had been shaken. Eisenhower's assessment was this: Montgomery was a talented general. He was strong in organization and planning, but he had an ego problem. He couldn't appreciate other successes. He appropriated every victory for himself. This was unacceptable in coalition command. The Ardennes press conference perfectly summarized Montgomery's character. While American units were fighting, he was trying to take credit. While Patton was performing a historic maneuver, he was reorganizing. And then he came and declared himself a hero. Eisenhower also emphasized a political lesson. Managing an alliance was harder than winning wars. Different egos, different interests, different national prides. All had to be balanced. Montgomery didn't understand this balance. He only saw his own perspective. Bradley was harsher about Montgomery in his own memoirs. In his book, A Soldier's Story, he described the Ardennes crisis in detail. He wrote how Montgomery's press conference angered him. He didn't hide the resignation threat. He described Eisenhower's intervention with appreciation. Bradley's assessment was clear. Montgomery stole American sacrifices. He disrespected the memory of 19,000 dead American soldiers. He ignored Patton's heroism. This was unforgivable. Patton wrote much more harshly in his diaries. He characterized Montgomery as that British charlatan. He described the press conference as history's greatest theft. He criticized Eisenhower for not removing Montgomery from command. Patton's January 7 diary entry was particularly striking. Montgomery lied to the world press. My soldiers died for Bastogne. Bradley's men defended every meter of ground. And that Brit comes and says, I saved them. This is a scandal. Eisenhower should fire him. The memoirs of the two American generals converged on a common point. Montgomery's press conference was a turning point in American-British military relations. Trust could never be fully restored after that day. Montgomery's January 7, 1945 press conference remained an important moment in World War II history. Not militarily, but politically, the military facts are clear. Of the 19,000 soldiers who died in the Ardennes, more than 18,000 were American. Patton made the first counterattack. Americans saved Bastogne. Montgomery's role was real but limited. He stabilized the defense on the northern front, but he started the counterattack late. Victory was won with American blood. But Montgomery didn't see these things, or didn't want to see them. His ego overshadowed the facts. At the press conference, he declared himself a hero. He belittled the Americans, and he nearly destroyed the alliance. Eisenhower's response was measured but decisive. He didn't directly accuse Montgomery, but he revealed the facts. He emphasized the American contribution, and most importantly, he withdrew his trust from Montgomery. First Army was taken back. The alliance continued, but now it was different. Churchill's role was critical with his House of Commons speech. He acknowledged the Americans' rights. The British Prime Minister chose the alliance over national pride. This was leadership. The Ardennes crisis perfectly exemplified the difficulties of coalition warfare. Different countries, different egos, different narratives. All had to be managed. Montgomery didn't understand this management, and the result was nearly catastrophic. Today, when military historians study the Ardennes, they see Montgomery's press conference as a critical mistake. It might have been ineffective militarily, but politically it was destructive. It shook the alliance. It destroyed trust, and it opened a lasting wound in American-British military relations. Eisenhower's way of handling this crisis is a leadership textbook. He was angry but controlled. He was right but diplomatic. He punished Montgomery but preserved the alliance. This balance was one of Eisenhower's greatest achievements. Montgomery's legacy remained complex. A talented general, but a difficult ally. A brilliant tactician, but a blind politician. The hero of El Alamein, but the owner of the Ardennes scandal. And the words Eisenhower said that angry afternoon went down in history. Montgomery is stealing the blood of American soldiers. This is unacceptable. These words showed that a commander's loyalty to his soldiers was more important than political calculations. And this stance made Eisenhower not just a general, but a true leader. If this story affected you, please hit the like button. Every like helps us reach more people with forgotten stories. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Leave a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. America, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. This community is spread all over the world. And every viewer here plays a role in ensuring history is not forgotten. Thank you for watching.